Momentum begins long before results appear. It starts in the quiet decision to act when hesitation feels easier. Most people imagine momentum as something dramatic, a sudden surge of productivity or an explosion of motivation. But real momentum forms almost invisibly through repeated focused actions that seem too small to matter in the moment. The first step rarely feels powerful. It often feels uncomfortable, slow, and uncertain. Yet that single step changes the internal state of the mind from passive thinking to active movement. Once movement begins, the brain starts adjusting to the expectation of continuation, and what initially required effort slowly becomes easier to repeat. Focused action is the foundation of this process because momentum cannot grow in scattered attention. When energy is divided between multiple distractions, progress loses direction, and the feeling of being busy replaces the experience of actually moving forward. Focus gathers mental resources into one point, concentrating effort so that even small actions create measurable progress. This concentration sends a clear signal to the brain that the task matters, strengthening engagement and reducing resistance. Over time, the act of returning attention to the same meaningful objective builds a mental pathway that makes starting again less difficult than it was before. Many people underestimate how strongly starting influences continuation. The hardest part of meaningful work is rarely the work itself. It is crossing the threshold from inactivity to action. Once a person begins, the natural human tendency toward completion begins to take over. The mind prefers finishing what is already started, and this psychological inclination supports the growth of momentum. Each time a task is completed, even a small one, the brain registers a sense of progress that reinforces the likelihood of beginning again. Repetition of this cycle gradually reduces the emotional friction associated with effort, replacing it with a sense of rhythm. Momentum also reshapes perception of difficulty. When someone is not in motion, tasks appear larger than they actually are, and uncertainty exaggerates the imagined effort required. After several sessions of focused action, those same tasks begin to feel manageable because the individual has already demonstrated the ability to handle similar challenges. Experience replaces speculation, and confidence becomes grounded in real evidence rather than hopeful thinking. This evidence-based confidence strengthens consistency, and consistency allows momentum to stabilize instead of collapsing after short bursts of enthusiasm. Attention is one of the most valuable resources in this process because it determines where effort is directed. In an environment filled with interruptions, protecting attention becomes an active discipline rather than a passive habit. Notifications, quick entertainment, and constant switching between unrelated activities gradually weaken the mind's capacity for sustained focus. Each interruption forces the brain to reorient itself, consuming energy that could have been invested in deeper progress. By deliberately reducing these interruptions and committing to uninterrupted work periods, a person creates conditions where momentum can grow naturally instead of constantly restarting from zero. Another element that strengthens momentum is clarity. When the next action is clearly defined, hesitation decreases. Uncertainty about what to do next often leads to delay, not because the person lacks ability, but because the mind resists ambiguity. Clear planning removes that ambiguity by identifying the exact step that should be taken immediately. Once the step is taken, the next step becomes easier to identify, forming a continuous chain of action that keeps forward movement alive. Over time, this chain becomes a personal operating rhythm where effort flows more smoothly from one task to the next without long pauses. Momentum influences identity as well. Repeated focused action gradually shapes how individuals see themselves. Instead of viewing themselves as people who occasionally try, they begin to see themselves as people who execute consistently. This identity shift changes internal dialogue, reducing the frequency of self-doubt and increasing the expectation of follow-through. When identity aligns with consistent action, discipline requires less conscious force because behavior begins to match self-perception automatically. The person no longer asks whether they should act. Action becomes the default response. There are periods when progress appears invisible, and these periods test commitment. During such times, it may seem as if effort is producing no immediate reward, creating the temptation to stop and search for faster results elsewhere. Yet momentum often accumulates beneath the surface before it becomes visible externally. Skills are improving, understanding is deepening, and systems are becoming more efficient even when measurable outcomes have not yet appeared. Continuing focused action through these invisible phases allows the eventual results to emerge with greater strength because the underlying foundation has been reinforced repeatedly. Consistency plays a critical role in protecting momentum. Large bursts of effort, followed by long periods of inactivity, create repeated restarts, each requiring the mind to overcome the same initial resistance again. Smaller but regular sessions of concentrated work maintain continuity, allowing progress to compound instead of resetting. Over weeks and months, this continuity creates a widening gap between those who act consistently and those who depend on occasional motivation. The difference is not necessarily talent or intelligence. It is the uninterrupted chain of actions that keeps advancing one step at a time. Momentum also changes emotional experience during work. At the beginning of a project, effort often feels heavy because the brain has not yet adapted to the routine. After repeated sessions, engagement becomes smoother, and the sense of resistance decreases. Work begins to feel less like pushing and more like flowing because the mind has accepted the activity as part of its regular pattern. This shift reduces the amount of willpower required to maintain progress, making long-term persistence more sustainable. Energy management supports this cycle as well. When attention is invested primarily in meaningful actions instead of constant switching, mental fatigue decreases, leaving more strength available for sustained concentration. The person feels less scattered and more directed, which reinforces the willingness to continue. As willingness strengthens, the speed of returning to work after breaks increases, preserving the rhythm of movement that keeps momentum expanding over time. Momentum grows through the repeated decision to continue, even when the step taken today seems small compared to the larger goal. Each repetition adds a layer of stability to the process, gradually transforming isolated efforts into a continuous stream of progress. The individual may not always feel inspired and the work may not always feel exciting, yet the steady return to focused action keeps strengthening the forward trajectory, allowing effort to compound quietly while the structure of consistent execution becomes stronger with every deliberate step taken in the same chosen direction, where attention remains anchored to meaningful tasks and the habit of beginning again continues, reinforcing the expanding cycle of movement that keeps progress advancing through sustained concentration applied repeatedly to the actions that matter most, while the rhythm of execution deepens through repetition and the internal resistance that once slowed the start gradually loses its influence as the expectation of continued action becomes familiar, and the mind adapts to the steady pattern of focused engagement that keeps extending the chain of purposeful steps forward through time, without waiting for perfect emotional conditions or external pressure, allowing the simple act of starting again to remain the driving force that keeps momentum alive through the consistent return to intentional work, where each completed action strengthens readiness for the next and the next and the next, maintaining a continuous flow of deliberate effort that keeps advancing progress through the ongoing repetition of concentrated execution applied to the path that remains, steadily unfolding through sustained attention directed toward meaningful outcomes that continue taking shape step by step through the uninterrupted rhythm of focused movement that keeps building forward through time without waiting for perfect emotional conditions or external pressure, allowing the simple act of starting again to remain the driving force that keeps momentum alive through the consistent return to intentional work, where each completed action strengthens readiness for the next and the next and the next, maintaining a continuous flow of deliberate effort that keeps advancing progress through the ongoing repetition of concentrated execution applied to the path that remains steadily unfolding through sustained attention directed toward meaningful outcomes that continue taking shape step by step through the uninterrupted rhythm of focused movement that keeps building forward through time.